Welcome to Unit 4, session number 2. We're going to look at Mark's account of the resurrection in this session. So, why should we begin with Mark? Well, Mark was likely the first gospel written, even though Matthew appears first in the New Testament based off of sort of historical reconstruction. It seems that Mark was written the earliest. In fact, when we look at it, Matthew and Luke frequently use Mark as a source of information. So there's a remarkable amount of overlap between these three gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And when it's you sort of reconstruct it, it looks like Mark is the sort of common denominator. It's the foundational piece that then Matthew and Luke then use to expand and tell the stories that they know as well. So there's some issues though with Mark's gospel. If you pick up your Bible, you'll likely at the very end, right after verse 8 in chapter 16, you'll see this note that says that the earliest manuscripts don't have verses 9 through 20, which is a fascinating detail. If you stop at verse 8, then the story ends with an empty tomb and a message about Jesus, but we never meet Jesus. So if we go with the earliest ending, the one that we have in most manuscripts from the very earliest times, we don't ever actually see a resurrected Jesus in this account, which is fascinating. But that doesn't mean that it didn't originally exist. So ancient documents were brittle and they didn't have copy machines to make a bunch of copies. And so the suggestion is that the ending of Mark's gospel perhaps was lost, that perhaps it didn't actually end at verse 8, but it went on with something that looks like verses 9 through 20, but that the ending of it was sort of lost. And the beginning and ending of documents were prone to getting lost in the ancient world. This is like evidence that we see from other documents, that the first pages and the last pages, if you will, are what are most common to be sort of messed up. And if you think it's because those are the ones that are exposed to the elements, and so that makes a good bit of sense. And so if Mark's ending gets messed up and lost, you may wonder, well, why didn't they just immediately fix it? Well, perhaps by the time it's lost, they already have Matthew or Luke's accounts of the Gospels. And Matthew and Luke use Mark so extensively, there's suggestion that maybe the ending of Mark is reflected in the ending of Matthew, chapter 28. And you can see this, that Matthew 28, 5 verses 5 through 8 look a lot like Mark 16, verses 6 through 8. And so perhaps then the rest of the ending of Matthew was similar to what the original ending of the book of Mark is. Now, all of this is sort of speculation, but it's intriguing nonetheless that there seems to be some evidence that perhaps Mark did have something that looked like verses 9 through 20 in the earliest versions of it. Now, when we look more broadly at Mark's account, we can notice a few things. First, it's told from the women's perspective. And as we said, that's an interesting detail. You would expect, if you're trying to make an argument, that you would describe it from the men's perspective. But that's not what happens. And then the resurrection is an unexpected event for Mark. It's not something that anyone was thinking would happen. Finally, the empty tomb raises important questions. It doesn't cause hope like Paul's accounts of the resurrection do. And then, of course, the women were afraid. And that's an interesting way to finish a gospel account. So, Mark's rhetorical effect. Okay, clearly there's more to the story, even if it ends in verse 8 with fear. There's clearly more to the story. The women obviously don't keep silent forever because we get the rest of the New Testament. They continue to talk about something that happened. So, even if Mark chapter 16 ends at verse 8, the question we need to ask is, how did Christianity come into existence? Well, it must be something like what we see happening in the other gospel accounts of the resurrection, which we'll dive into in the next few sessions.